Go big. Do 3 big, heavy Avengers Secret Wars, Doomsday, whatever films, and make it that cohesive trilogy. Hey everybody, Colton here, and in this one we've got a question from Trey. Trey writes, will Avengers Secret Wars be the last Avengers movie before the reboot, or will they make a Secret Wars 2, or like an Avengers Time Runs Out movie they just haven't announced yet? All right, great question, Trey. And today we've got some news about, this. There'd been this rumor, this report going around about, are they going to split Avengers Secret Wars into 2 movies? If you've been around here for a little while, you know my thoughts on that. We'll talk about that here in a second. But I want to read the initial report, and then we'll jump into it, and I'll answer Trey's question. So initially, Alex Perez of the Cosmic Circus, a somewhat reliable industry insider, scooper, leaker, whatever you want to call him, he put out a statement, I think in a Q&A that he does on his Discord. We've read those before here on the channel. He said that Marvel cannot legally film anything for Secret Wars until a new verification of the contract is achieved. So they haven't started filming Secret Wars yet, and apparently they're in a situation where they can't. In the few instances that this has happened, so when it's happened before, it's because there has been a massive shift from what the production was originally looking like. For example, one film now being split into 2 parts. And he's also talked about how Secret Wars is in now a conditional start phase or something like that. Now, a lot of people, of course, ran with that and talked about, okay, well, is this proof that they're looking at splitting Secret Wars into 2 movies? Now, in response to that, another industry insider, Jeff Snyder, he has said, as of right now, Marvel is not planning to split Avengers Secret Wars into 2 films. That may have been mentioned by someone somewhere along the chain of power, but it is not being seriously discussed in Burbank, that's where Marvel is, due to the difficulty of scheduling the enormous cast. Not to mention the prospect of having to pay Robert Downey Jr.'s even more enormous salary once again. And I'm reading this on comicbookmovie.com, and this article's by Mark Cassidy. Mark added his little bit of commentary here where he says, it sounds like Kevin Feige and co. may have given the notion of a Secret Wars split some serious thought. But as Snyder notes, it could ultimately bite them in the ass with audiences who would smell the corporate greed from a mile away. All right. So here are my thoughts on that. Number 1, I've been saying that splitting a movie in 2, that's just not a thing that is done. Okay, you don't make a movie and then go, oh, you know what? This is a little long. Let's cut it right down the middle and release that. That's just not a thing. Now, if you're in the early stages of planning your big movie and you decide, you know what, this is really big, how about we take a lot of this stuff and do a sequel to this movie? But when doing, sorry, my brain broke for a second. When you do that, you can't just splice your script in half and do it that way. No, yes, you take the script, you say, okay, up to this point of the story is what we're going to tell in the first one, and up to this point in the story, and that point of the story and on is what we'll do in the second one. But you have to add in some other stuff to make it work. You have to move things around to make it work. So this idea that, Secret Wars was just so big, we're going to split it in half, and it's going to be the exact same thing, just 2 hour-and-a-half long movies. No, that was never going to happen. That's not how it's done. Now, the idea of maybe the Secret Wars story is super big, so we could make it 2 movies. Perhaps so. And as I'll talk about here in a second, I think they should do a Secret Wars 2 and make this a trilogy. Have Avengers Doomsday, Avengers Secret Wars, and then another movie. Call it Secret Wars 2, whatever. Or you want to get real crazy, have Avengers Doomsday, and then do a Secret Wars trilogy. I've talked about this several times, so I won't go through the whole thing again, but I'll just say The MCU is very lacking when it comes to true trilogies, because any trilogy we have in the MCU, you also have to watch other movies for that trilogy to make sense. Can't watch the Cap trilogy without watching Avengers. Same thing for Thor. Same thing for Iron Man. And you can't really appreciate an Avengers trilogy without, the other, on the flip side, having seen those individual films that build up to those moments as well. With a Secret Wars trilogy, one that perhaps includes an additional Secret Wars movie or 2 Secret Wars movies, if Doomsday is not part of that trilogy, what you can do is you can have this full trilogy and don't release any other bullshit in between. Don't do anything else. Just tell that trilogy, and you could rival Lord of the Rings, Star Wars for one of the greatest trilogies of all time, I think. Now, it is tempting to say, hey, maybe you could tell like some other stories, do some other movies in between, maybe some TV shows in between, streaming shows that take place on Battleworld. That's all an appealing idea. I get that. But I really do like the idea of them just doing Avengers movies and cut out all the other bullshit for now. Just do the Avengers movies like this giant event trilogy over the next however many years. I think that would be great. Secret Wars is a huge story. You could totally do it. So I am hopeful that we do get more Secret Wars or more Avengers movies, part of this, whatever you want to call this, end of the multiverse saga, whatever, with Doomsday, and we know we're getting Secret Wars. I hope they do a little more before we reset and do everything. Now, there was also some other news today that the X-Men, the rebooted X-Men film, which is coming out in 2028, that it might start filming as early as this year. And that makes sense if it's coming out in 2028, and they want it to come out relatively quickly after Secret Wars comes out. So that means they would start filming the X-Men before Secret Wars even comes out. And that all makes sense. But here's where that gets, kind of throws a wrench into my hope that we could get more Avengers movies before they continue with, the Mutant Saga, which I think is going to be the next saga of the MCU. Is there a scenario where they film that and just shelve it for a while before they, and then, do more Avengers movies? Is there a scenario where they do that movie, but also do the Avengers movies at the same time? No, I don't think so. I think you save that X-Men movie for when you relaunch the universe, both from a outside fourth wall breaking perspective, but also in story. The in-universe reboot we're likely going to see whenever Secret Wars does ultimately end, whether that be in this Secret Wars movie or in another one. Now, to Trey's question, he mentioned Time Runs Out. Time Runs Out led up to Secret Wars in the comics, so I don't think you do Doomsday, Secret Wars, and then Time Runs Out. What they could maybe do is do Doomsday and then have like this big announcement, hey, we're delaying Secret Wars, and everybody's like, oh, because we're doing Time Runs Out before we do Secret Wars. That could be a cool scenario. I just think that this story, it's so big, it's so grand, it is basically the grand finale of everything Marvel. Why not do that trilogy? Why leave it at 2? They kind of did a 1-2 punch with Infinity War and then Endgame, and that's what they're mimicking here with Doomsday Secret Wars. They've skipped over doing like the traditional Avengers movie, like 1 and Age of Ultron. I've got a video on that going up on Screen Crush, I believe, tomorrow, so be sure to check that out. But really, why not make the stakes bigger? Marvel likes, going big. They like, sometimes doing way too much stuff. So I get if they're like learning the lesson that, oh, we did too much stuff, maybe we don't need to overextend ourselves. But if you just focus on doing this trilogy and that's the only thing Marvel Studios is working on movie-wise, then you could totally do it. No problemo, you could do it. So why not, go big, do 3 big, heavy Avengers, Secret Wars, Doomsday, whatever films, and make it that cohesive trilogy. So while I believe the report that Secret Wars in its current form is not going to be split in 2 in the sense of we have our story beginning, middle, end, and we're going to make that middle the end and then do an... You would have to rework so much. And as it was talked about, here with Perez's quote, that making movies is a business, and each movie, each production is like a business in itself, almost like I don't think it's an LLC, but it's like its own little business, and they borrow money, and it's this whole operation, single thing. You can't do like, they wouldn't be able to film all of Secret Wars and say, get this 4-hour cut and then say, okay, we're going to split it into two and release it as two movies. They can't do that legally and then like only pay Robert Downey Jr. and all the other actors for one movie. It doesn't work that way. The contracts won't allow for it. And Perez kind of talked about that. So the only scenario I could see Secret Wars being split into two movies is if they ultimately decide, hey, we're gonna do two movies. But even then, I don't think it's splitting. You're really creating a whole other movie. You're creating another 50%, really. Does that make sense? Or because sure, if you're gonna take away some from the first Secret Wars and put it into a second, fine. But you have to fill that space with something else. And with the other one, you have to fill it out as well. You have to give movies a shape. There's a structure to making a movie. I really don't think take any like long ass movie. Really, Kill Bill was the only one that worked. I think Kill Bill 1 and 2 were like one movie, and they kind of they did split that in half. I haven't seen Kill Bill in so long. I can't even remember, how well that worked. Isn't that weird? I haven't seen Kill Bill since I was a kid, volume 1 or 2. But anyway, that is the only way that they could split it. It's kind of like what George Lucas did with Star Wars. Star Wars started out as one big idea. And then Lucas realized, okay, I don't have did he say he didn't have the budget, or it was just all too big or something? Anyway, I can't remember what the exact reasoning was, but it was one full story that ended with the Death Star blowing up. But then he realized, okay, I have to pare this down and do one movie, and then I'm going to do a second one and a third one. But he still wanted that first movie to end with the Death Star blowing up. So he rearranged certain things, brought that ending to Star Wars, and then he did that ending again in Return of the Jedi. That's why we see the Death Star get blown up twice, because it was really always the plan for that to just be the big finale of the movie. But that's another example of taking a script and dividing it into 3 movies. George Lucas didn't take his Star Wars script and just cut it in thirds. He took the general outline, the story idea, and cut that into thirds, and then filled each one out. That's what you would do with Secret Wars. And, I don't know that there was anybody out there necessarily saying, no, what they're doing is Secret Wars. They've written it, and they have the whole thing planned, and they're just going to cut it in half because it's too long. I did hear some people say that they think they might do that for Doomsday, which I just completely disagreed. There was no way in hell they were going to take like a 3-hour Doomsday and go, hey, why don't we cut it into 2 and put out an hour and a half Doomsday and an hour and a half Doomsday Part 2, make twice the money? No, there's no way they would have done that. 1, they couldn't. 2, an hour and a half Avengers movie would be like, well, what are we doing? This is supposed to be a nearly 3-hour epic event movie. It's sometimes like you do a YouTube video and you think, oh, you know what? I'm talking about a few different things in this video. Maybe I could chop that up into 3 different videos. Well, then they lose those topics. This is kind of a behind the curtain. Those topics in themselves don't warrant a whole video, but together they make for an interesting video. Kind of like in this one, I talked about the X-Men news, right? I didn't have enough to say to really warrant that being an entire video, but it was a great thing to mention in this video. So no, they never would have done that with Doomsday, and I don't think they'll do it with Secret Wars. Some people point to the how Lord of the Rings and like Avatar, they have filmed bits and pieces of those movies at the same time, but that was like a pre-planned thing. And maybe that's something Marvel is trying to, get together right now, this idea of maybe filming the movies back to back, like a Secret Wars 1 and 2, or whatever that third film would be. Maybe filming them back to back to save money on production costs, so you're not shutting down and restarting production or keeping a very short window between your shutdown and start of production. But you still have to rework the contracts and all that with your cast, with your crew, because it's 2 separate movies. Have I rambled on long enough about that? Thank you guys so much for watching, and let me know, do you want to see an additional Avengers film on top of Doomsday and Secret Wars? Do you think that they will reveal, hey, we had this full story for Secret Wars, but we think it's just too big, we need to chop it up into more? If they do that, if they do that, I'm right? Well, you can't just chop it. You got to add some additional stuff to it. And hey, that would be great. If you have this full arching story and then you decide, hey, this is big enough for 2 movies, but we still need to fill those out a little bit. Well, then, hey, you can put more cool, fun stuff in the movie. I want it. I want more Secret Wars stuff. I'm loving Doomsday and prepping for Doomsday. I'm loving that. That's a good idea for a series. Doomsday prepping, it's a good idea for a video series. Anyway, I'm loving all this build up to Doomsday and Secret Wars, and I hope that there will be a third film before we get into that rebooted MCU. All right. Thank you so much for watching. Thank you for the question, Trey. I will see you guys soon. Bye.
You're still here. It's over. Go home.